Right now, the Trump administration is openly engaging in a blatant effort to overthrow the government of Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela. It is a campaign aimed at regime change, and it's being promoted openly as an opportunity to steal Venezuelan oil for the benefit of U.S. corporations. They're not even pretending. Here's National Security Advisor John Bolton on Fox News.
I think we're trying to get to the same end result here. Venezuela is one of the three countries I call the troika of tyranny. It'll make a big difference to the United States economically if we could have American oil companies really invest in and produce the oil capabilities in Venezuela. It'd be good.
But this is not some insane Twitter thought spewed by Trump after guzzling down gallons of Fox and Friends. It's an open imperialism that is being embraced not just by Republicans and Trump supporters, but by powerful Democrats as well. Amid protests against Maduro last week, the head of the opposition in Venezuela, Juan Guaido, declared himself the legitimate president of Venezuela during a protest last Wednesday. That move was immediately backed by the United States, and the Trump administration recognized Guaido as the president. Maduro rejected Guaido's claim and accused the U.S. of attempting a coup d'etat. Immediately, he ordered U.S. diplomats to leave the country, but Maduro has since walked that back while maintaining the position that the U.S. should stay out of Venezuela's affairs.
Donald Trump, hands up Venezuela.
This push for regime change in Venezuela did not appear in a vacuum. The CIA has been plotting with so-called rebels in Venezuela from the early days of the Trump administration.
Trump administration discussed a coup with rebel Venezuelan officers. American officials are telling the Times that the administration indeed held secret meetings with rebellious military officers to discuss plans to overthrow President Nicolas Maduro.
And now, with the media focus on the shutdown and Trump's atrocious wall plan, it appears to have been put on the fast track. Nicolas Maduro was sworn in for a second six-year term earlier this month. The right-wing opposition took the opportunity to renew protests after the last major anti-government protests were suppressed by security forces back in 2017. So on the eve of a major demonstration against Maduro's new term this year, according to the Wall Street Journal, Vice President Mike Pence called Guaido to tell him that should he challenge Maduro for the presidency, that the U.S. would support him. And that's exactly what happened.
Asumir formalmente las competencias del Ejecutivo Nacional como el presidente encargado de Venezuela.
All across the so-called liberal media, the reporting and analysis on Venezuela these past weeks has been atrocious. And actually, it's been this way for a long time. We should remember that the New York Times actually openly supported the 2002 coup against Hugo Chavez. But in the wake of recent Venezuelan elections, there's been a total uniformity to the characterization of Venezuela's suffering and chaos as the sole fault of Nicolas Maduro. The elections are being denounced by anchors as though it's just accepted fact that Maduro is only president because of corruption. Almost never mentioned prominently is the fact that Venezuela has been systematically targeted by the United States and its allies and its puppets in Latin America, or the impact that economic sanctions have had on the country, or the fact that there was an attempt to kill Nicolas Maduro with a drone packed with explosives. The story is just Maduro is a corrupt socialist dictator. He needs to be taken out so that Venezuela can be free. The central role that the U.S. has played under Bush, under Obama, and now under Trump in destabilizing Venezuela, it's just an afterthought, if it's even mentioned at all. One of MSNBC's favorite conservatives, Hugh Hewitt, even suggested last weekend on Meet the Press that overthrowing Maduro could bring a kumbaya moment for liberals and Donald Trump.
And it is far more important to shut down the Maduro government than our government. And I think Donald Trump is leading there, and he is winning there because of Bolton and Pompeo going down to see Bolsonaro and Duque. That's going to happen. That's going to bring us together.
Now, Hugh Hewitt, of course, is up to his neck in crazy. But if he was just talking about the political elite uniting behind Trump to overthrow the government of Venezuela, then he probably has a point. Senate Minority Whip Dick Durbin, a powerful Democrat from Illinois, released a statement praising Trump for, quote, appropriately recognizing Guaido. House Intelligence Committee Chair Adam Schiff said Trump was right to recognize Guaido as president. And then there was this insane propaganda video released by some Democrats on the Foreign Relations Committee. They included Debbie Wasserman Schultz, Elliott Engel, and the former Clinton Health and Human Services Secretary, Donna Shalala. They declared, quote, "We refuse to recognize the legitimacy of Maduro's presidency."
Maduro's administration held fraudulent elections, and he has lost his mandate.
We cannot allow Nicolas Maduro to destroy his country, to continue to steamroll democracy, and to act with impunity.
If all of that is not cringeworthy enough, let's look at the man appointed to spearhead this bipartisan Venezuela policy.
Today, I am incredibly excited to announce that a seasoned, principled, and tough-minded foreign policy veteran is joining our State Department team. Elliott Abrams is coming aboard to lead our efforts on Venezuela.
Elliott Abrams is a notorious neoconservative and was actually a so-called never-Trumper who penned op-eds opposing Donald Trump. Well, clearly a good old-fashioned coup d'etat mission was too juicy for Abrams to pass up.
Very briefly, I left this building 30 years ago this week, last time I worked here, so it's very nice to be back.
Let's be clear here. Elliott Abrams is an unrepentant war criminal. He played a central role in the mass slaughter of tens of thousands of people across Central and Latin America in the dirty wars of the 1980s. He was a player in the Iran-Contra scandal. But we're told Abrams is an adult. Abrams is an old Latin America hand. It's sickening. This administration brought in Abrams because of his immorality and his willingness to support mass murder. It's the only reason he's there. And no one with even a flimsy grasp of morality should be welcoming his appointment as special envoy on Venezuela. And let's remember that in 2002, during the Bush-Cheney administration, Abrams was a major proponent of the coup against Hugo Chavez. But even some Democrats have praised the Abrams appointment. Among those was former Clinton ambassador to the UN and former Energy Secretary Bill Richardson. He said that the Trump administration was, quote, smart to bring in Abrams, saying, and I'm quoting here, "This is good, and they're bringing sort of the moderate Republican Bush foreign policy advisors in." Elliott Abrams, a moderate? That's just nuts. On Fox News, Bill Richardson also praised Trump for recognizing the Guaido administration.
You know, I'm not a big fan of the president's foreign policy, but on this issue, it was a bold move what they did, recognizing the assembly leader.
As Donald Trump has cozied up to strongmen and dictators across the globe, from Vladimir Putin to Mohammed bin Salman, Rodrigo Duterte, Kim Jong-un, Abdel Fattah al-Sisi of Egypt, it seems that he's found the one so-called strongman that he just can't tolerate. And that leader, the leader of Venezuela, happens to have the largest oil reserves in the world.
Well, we're looking at Venezuela. It's a very sad situation. That was the richest state in all of that area. That's a big, beautiful area, and by far the richest. And now it's one of the poorest places in the world. That's what socialism gets you.
We've heard this justification for intervention, for coups, for war, for sanctions from the United States throughout history. The United States needs to go and free the people from their undemocratic leaders. It's all a huge rescue mission for those poor people who are going to be so happy when the United States comes to liberate them. It's all a big lie. This week, the Trump administration announced that it had imposed new sanctions against Venezuela's state-owned oil company. And the State Department said that it was taking action to make sure that all of the money and other assets owned by Venezuela in the U.S. and elsewhere around the world would be handed over to the control of the U.S.-backed puppet Guaido. Buried within a New York Times report on the sanctions on Tuesday is this tidbit. The sanctions included exceptions to allow the American oil company Chevron, along with Dick Cheney's former company Halliburton, to continue working in Venezuela. That tells you everything you need to know about what's happening right now. Later in the program, we are going to dig deep into how Venezuela got to this point, the role that the United States has played in destabilizing that country, and who exactly the U.S.-backed figure Juan Guaido is. But first, to discuss the broader implications of this coup d'etat in motion, I'm joined by the renowned investigative journalist Allan Nairn. As a reporter, he has played a significant role in exposing United States involvement and sponsorship of brutal regimes and security forces around the globe. He survived the Dili massacre in East Timor in the early 1990s. He exposed the CIA's financing of right-wing death squads in Haiti and other countries, as well as the CIA's support for brutal military dictators in places like Guatemala and El Salvador. Allan Nairn also debated Trump's Venezuela point man Elliott Abrams on national television in the 1990s, and in that debate, he called for Abrams to stand trial for war crimes. Allan Nairn, welcome back to Intercepted.
Thanks. Good to be with you.
Big picture here, Allan. It does seem as though within the Trump administration that they are organizing a kind of coup or throwback to the 50s, 60s team within the Trump administration aimed at Venezuela. In the bigger picture, how do you see these developments with Elliott Abrams coming on board, John Bolton there as National Security Advisor?
Well, it is possible that the U.S. will choose to attack Venezuela militarily. That might be attractive to Trump. First, because in 2016, he laid out the doctrine of to the winner go the spoils.
Take the oil. Take the oil. Keep the oil. You know, in the old days, to the victor belong the spoils. To us, we go in and fight. We lose trillions of dollars. We lose thousands and thousands of unbelievable people. We have wounded wars who I love all over the place. We get nothing. Look at Iraq. What do we get? Nothing. And Iran now takes over Iraq.
Venezuela has the world's largest oil reserves. But even more importantly, Trump needs a new war. He needs his own war, and he hasn't started one yet. And that fits with his method of creating new spectacles. The institutions, the Pentagon, State, and the CIA, would probably have second thoughts because, first, it wouldn't be clear whether they could get it over with quickly. And second, it's not even clear that they would win because they would encounter some serious resistance within Venezuela. So it seems what they're trying to do now is to try to get the army to defect, get them to stage a coup and bring down Maduro. It's kind of remarkable that some people maintain the pretense that the U.S. cares at all about elections anywhere. This is just another illustration of that.
Allan, I wanted to get your response to the New York Times coverage on Tuesday and what they reported. And this was buried deep within the article on Venezuela, but I'll just read it to you. Francisco Monaldi, a Venezuelan oil expert at Rice University in Texas, compared the latest round of sanctions that the Trump administration announced against Venezuela to a, quote, nuclear bomb. But he said that the moves appeared aimed not at crippling the Venezuelan oil company, but blocking Maduro's access to the revenue. And it points out that the sanctions included exceptions to allow the American oil company Chevron, as well as Halliburton, the oil services provider once run by Dick Cheney, to continue working in Venezuela. You have that, and then you also have Florida Senator Marco Rubio openly tweeting that a coup in Venezuela, a regime change, would be beneficial to American workers and American oil companies. Again, this was buried at the bottom of this Times piece. But Allan, your response to this news?
It sounds like they're putting a priority on helping the American oil companies. Even more significant was the statement by Bolton. Essentially, when the U.S. takes over Venezuela, they want to have the U.S. companies do the actual oil production in place of the state oil company. Now, that's especially remarkable because it means rolling back an arrangement that predates Hugo Chavez, that predates the Bolivarian movement.
In Venezuela's lost world, the Caroni River has thundered down the rapids for no one knows how many thousands of years. But Venezuela, newly rich from her vast oil reserves, is busy developing her other resources. While some oil countries spend their revenue on adding to the royal stock of concubines and Cadillacs, Venezuela believes in putting her prosperity on firm foundations.
The oil production in Venezuela was nationalized before Chavez came to power. So that old U.S.-backed state capitalism is now ruled inadmissible by John Bolton and the U.S., and they're proposing to go in and just, as Trump put it, take the oil and give it to U.S. companies. But in today's world, it's no longer necessary for economic purposes, for overall economic purposes, to actually control natural resources that are sold in an open market like oil. The only real gain is a political one, where you have control over that oil, and you can, if you want, withhold it from certain countries, and you can manipulate it in various ways for political purposes.
Secretary of State Mike Pompeo on January 25th certified that the U.S. position is that Juan Guaido is the legitimate president right now of Venezuela, and they took moves to ensure that certain property that is held in accounts by the United States or its international allies, but specifically the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, that all of the money that Venezuela has right now in the U.S. and other markets belongs to Juan Guaido's government. What about this posture that the U.S. government is taking that Juan Guaido, who got a grand total of 0 votes for president of Venezuela, is now essentially in charge of all of Venezuela's international holdings?
In addition to allowing the U.S. to rewrite the notion of political sovereignty, assuming for itself the right to really name anyone a president of any country. I mean, if they follow that principle, what's to stop naming any individual in any country anywhere in the world as the recognized president? They're also messing with the very notion of property. This is the kind of thing that maybe should give other countries and even foreign capitalists and rich people some pause when placing their holdings within the borders or within the control of the U.S. government. Because the principle they seem to be establishing is if the U.S. turns against you politically, they can just take your property straight up. It should give pause to lots of people who are using U.S. banks now.
The National Security Advisor, Allan, John Bolton, walked into a press briefing on Monday holding a yellow notepad.
Thank you very much, Sarah. As you know, on January the 23rd, President Trump officially recognized the president of the Venezuelan National Assembly, Juan Guaido, as the interim president of Venezuela.
And on the pad was a handwritten note. It said, "Afghanistan, welcome the talks." And then underneath it, it said 5,000 troops to Colombia. Now, we don't know exactly the genesis of that phrase being written on this notepad, but certainly the United States has bankrolled so much of Colombia's military and paramilitary operations. Now the U.S. is upping its military presence and work inside of Brazil that is now under the fascist government of Jair Bolsonaro. What do you see as the significance, if anything, of that phrase written on John Bolton's pad, 5,000 troops to Colombia? I mean, I guess it's also possible that it's a psychological operation, given that Bolton keeps saying all options are on the table. But what should people know about the potential for 5,000 troops to go to Colombia?
If it were an actual plan, it would fit in with other things. When Pompeo was the CIA director, he openly mused about staging a covert operation to bring down Maduro, and he talked about doing it in concert with Colombia, among others.
I'm always careful when we talk about South and Central America and the CIA. There's a lot of stories. So I want to be careful with what I say, but suffice to say, we are very hopeful that there can be a transition in Venezuela, and the CIA is doing its best to understand the dynamic there so that we can communicate to our State Department and to others. The Colombians, I was just down in Mexico City and in Bogota week before last, talking about this very issue, trying to help them understand the things they might do so that they can get a better outcome for their part of the world and our part of the world.
And when Bolsonaro was elected in Brazil, in the Brazilian press, immediately after, there was a senior person of Bolsonaro saying that they would be ready to join the U.S. And countries like Colombia to bring down Maduro. So it wouldn't be surprising if the U.S. Were to do that, either as part of an ultimate actual U.S. armed attack on Venezuela, or as a means of pressure and threat.
Well, and I want to ask you the origin story of how you ended up on Charlie Rose on his program in 1995, where you debated Elliott Abrams. But first, just describe the role that Elliott Abrams has played in U.S. Policy, particularly in Central and Latin America, from Reagan through Bush 1, Bush 2, and now in the Trump administration.
Abrams was one of the real intellectual architects of the U.S. policy of abetting genocide in Guatemala and massacres throughout Central America. I put it that way because there was U.S.-backed systematic mass slaughter in both Guatemala and El Salvador, but it's in Guatemala that the local courts, have actually ruled that these actions constituted genocide. And secondly, they ruled that this was done in accord with the interests of the United States, a security doctrine imposed to protect the United States. And in these and in other cases, Abrams was right at the center of first making the policy, but maybe even more importantly, openly and full-throatedly defending it as being the right thing to do.
We began this evening with the story of Guatemala and the CIA connection. In Washington, Elliott Abrams joins us. Also, Robert Torricelli is here. The congressman joins us along with Allan Nairn of The Nation magazine as we begin.
He likewise, when asked about the El Mozote massacre in El Salvador, which killed more than 500 people, he denied that it had happened. He denied the facts.
Allan.
Charlie, you asked a hypothetical. How would Mr. Abrams react? In fact, we have this historical record. We can see how he and the other Reagan and Bush and Clinton officials have reacted. In '85, when human rights leader Rosario Godoy was abducted by the army, raped and mutilated, her baby had his fingernails torn out. The Guatemalan military said, oh, they died in a traffic accident. The human rights groups contacted Mr. Abrams, asked him about it. He wrote back, this is his letter of reply. He said, yes, there's no evidence other than that they died in a traffic accident. This is a woman raped and mutilated, a baby with his fingernails torn out.
I want to come to Congressman
This is long-standing policy.
In a moment, but these are specific points raised by Allan having to do with your
I'll tell you, whatever Allan Nairn wants to do, Charlie, I'm not here to refight the Cold War. I'm glad we won. Maybe he's not. What I'm here to say is we're talking not about U.S. policy in the world.
One against who? One against those civilians the Guatemalan army was massacring?
Wait a minute. We're not here to refight the Cold War. We're here to talk about, I thought, a specific case in which an allegation is being made that the husband of an American, in another case an American citizen, were killed, and there was a CIA connection with the person allegedly involved in it. Now, I'm happy to talk about that kind of thing. If Mr. Nairn thinks we should have been on the other side in Guatemala, that is, we should have been in favor of a guerrilla victory, I disagree with him.
So you're then admitting that you were on the side of the Guatemalan military?
I am admitting that it was the policy of the United States under Democrats and Republicans, approved by Congress repeatedly, to oppose a communist guerrilla victory anywhere in Central America, including in Guatemala.
A communist guerrilla victory. 95% of these victims are civilians, peasant organizers, human rights leaders, priests, assassinated by the U.S.-backed Guatemalan army.
I'm happy to invite both of you back to review Reagan and Bush administration policy.
So when confronted with particular cases, Abrams would always lie. But when discussing the policy overall, the policy of the U.S. Arming and training and financing and providing intelligence to these mass murdering forces, Abrams would justify it. He would say, yes, we're doing the right thing. And in fact, and he's saying this is necessary to fight communism.
If we look at a case like this, I think we have to start talking about putting Guatemalan and U.S. officials on trial. I think someone like Mr. Abrams would be a fit a subject for such a Nuremberg-style inquiry. But I agree with Mr. Abrams that Democrats would have to be in the dock with him. The Congress has been in on this. The Congress approved the sale of 16,000 M16s to Guatemala. In 87 and 88,
hold on one second, because
they voted more military aid than the Republicans asked for.
And again, I invite you and Elliott Abrams back to discuss what he did. But right
thanks,
now,
Charlie. But I
hold on one second, Elliott. Go ahead. You want to repeat the question of you want to be in the dock?
It is ludicrous. It is ludicrous to respond to that kind of stupidity. This guy thinks we were on the wrong side in the Cold War. Maybe he personally was on the wrong side. I am one of the many millions of Americans who
Mr.
think
Abrams,
we were
on
happy
the wrong side
to
in supporting the massacre of peasants and organizers.
What I want to do is I want to ask the following
Absolutely,
question.
and that's a crime. That's a crime, Mr. Abrams, for which people should be tried.
You have read this
right. We'll put all the American officials who won the Cold War in the dock.
All right. You have read this.
Was there any fallout after that from Elliott Abrams or Charlie Rose's producers? I mean, it often is the case. You say something on major mainstream television that they are not accustomed to hearing, and later you hear it from the producers or the host who sort of chide you for having violated the norms of civility that exist among the foreign policy elite crowd on corporate TV.
Well, I wasn't that lucky. I wasn't lucky enough to get chided. I just never got invited back again.
As we wrap up with everything that you know about Elliott Abrams, what's going on here with making him the point man on Venezuela? What does that say to you with everything you know about his background?
Well, it reaffirms what was already obvious, and that is that they are ready to resort to violence if necessary, not just political means to bring down the Venezuelan government. An interesting twist on it, Abrams was a never-Trumper because Abrams comes out of the neoconservative movement. But it's notable that a high-profile guy like Abrams, who said things like that, is being brought back. He definitely is the right man for the job. He comes from the heart of the American foreign policy establishment. But I think the deeper point about all this, there's been a lot of talk about the clash between Trump and the deep state, Trump versus the establishment. But it's more of a spat than an actual long-term clash. I mean, I said a while ago, all they need is a couple of good new wars together and they'll start getting along just fine. It's really a disagreement between two different camps of war criminals who do have a tactical difference. They both agree first that the U.S. has the right to essentially extend the Monroe Doctrine to the entire globe and say the entire globe is the U.S. backyard, and that the U.S. has the right to invade anywhere at any time for any reason, on any pretext. The U.S. has that right. And secondly, that in doing so, the U.S. has the right to kill civilians in those countries with no repercussions, with no possibility or even no thought to the idea that American officials could be brought to justice for killing those civilians, even though that violates the local murder laws in Guatemala or Salvador or Nicaragua or Iraq or any other country in question, and the fact that in many cases it violates international law by constituting a crime against humanity, or even in some cases, like they just ruled in Guatemala, a genocide. So the Trumpers and the establishment people completely agree on those two premises. And once you have those two premises in place, you basically have a completely criminal, completely unacceptable foreign policy, and you explain most of the activity of U.S. foreign policy over the decades. The only difference they have is a tactical one. The Trump people say, go in, invade wherever you want, but do it absolutely without restraint, with no rules, no limits on how many civilians you can kill. One of the big criticisms from the Trump types was that during the Obama administration, to stage an operation, you had to go through lawyers at the National Security Council who had to sign off. And that was actually true. There was a process of sorting and monitoring, and certain operations, certain bombing runs or drone runs or special forces actions or whatever could be vetoed if they exceeded there was a permitted number of civilian casualties, but if they went over that, lawyers could actually veto them. And that's kind of been the establishment approach in recent years. The Bush Jr. White House also did that. When Trump came in, he said, screw that. throw all the rules out the window. When you go in, you, the Pentagon and CIA people on the ground, you have the authority to kill as many people as you feel you need to and many people as you want. Go ahead. But get it over with quickly. Get it over with quickly, and then let's try to get out. So it's one, go in without restraint, kill as many as you want, but get it over with quickly. That's the Trumper approach. The other establishment approach is do accept some restraints, do accept the restraints that have been imposed by the movements through Congress over the years, still be willing to kill tons of civilians. You know, Abrams backed the genocide in Guatemala, for God's sakes. But the idea is, yeah, the establishment types say we will accept some constraints, and also when we do our overseas actions, we will seek allies. We won't try to do it naked and alone. We'll try to get the Europeans on board. We'll try to get other countries in the region in question on board. In some cases, we'll even try to get the UN on board. They put a big priority on that. You know, the W. Bush people made that a major priority for their massively murderous moves into Iraq, for example. So they say, yeah, that we'll accept all those things. But also, once we get in there, we'll essentially stay forever. That's the establishment approach. So Trump, go in quickly, kill massively, come home. The establishment, go in with some restraints along the edges, but do an occupation that lasts indefinitely. And it's just a tactical difference, really. If, though, Trump decides to take a gamble and go into Venezuela with an actual invasion in hopes of having a Panama-style or Grenada-style action where the U.S. troops get in and out very quickly and they come home and there's a big celebration and Trump has a political spectacle and he gets actually praised for it on CNN and MSNBC. If Trump takes that chance, he will get a lot of establishment support. They'll all be riding in the same bus in the victory parade. So that's an important fact to realize. Trump does not represent a fundamental departure when it comes to the foreign policy approach, but he does represent a different tactical approach within the context of larger war crimes, and one that has not prevailed in recent years, because, both Obama and Bush Jr. certainly did things on the establishment tactical model.
All right, Allan, we're going to leave it there. Thank you very much for joining us on Intercepted.
Thanks.
Allan Nairn is a longtime investigative reporter. You can find him on Twitter at Allan Nairn 14.